Did medieval women really spend their days locked away, unable to read, always dirty, and fearing death in childbirth? For 1,000 years, from roughly 500 CE to 1500 CE, common ideas about women in the Middle Ages have painted a picture that is often wildly wrong. Get ready to peel back the layers of misconception and discover the astonishing realities. Number 10. Everyone believed women were just silent property. Many people picture medieval women as mere extensions of their fathers or husbands, entirely lacking a voice or any legal standing. The common belief suggests that women possess no property rights, no agency, and certainly no power, existing solely as objects to be transferred through marriage or inheritance. This view often comes from focusing too heavily on certain patriarchal laws or legal treatises that, while present, did not always reflect the lived experiences of women across all social strata and regions of medieval Europe. The reality, however, paints a much more complex and active picture of female involvement in economic and legal spheres. For example, the legal systems in many parts of Europe, particularly in common law traditions that began to develop, recognized a woman's right to dower, which was a portion of her deceased husband's property. This was not a small handout, it was a legally protected right to a third of his lands, sometimes even more, for her lifetime. This dower allowed widows a significant degree of economic independence and security, enabling them to manage estates, collect rents, and participate in legal proceedings as landowners themselves. A woman like Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful figures of the 12th century, inherited vast lands and wielded immense political influence, demonstrating that noblewomen were not mere silent ornaments, but active participants in the power struggles of their time. Her independent control over Aquitaine before her marriages to the King of France, and later the King of England, showcases a level of autonomy that defies the simple property label. Beyond the aristocracy, women of the merchant class frequently engaged in trade and business, often independently. Our records from various towns across England, France, and Italy show women operating shops, running taverns, managing guilds, and participating in international trade networks. They signed contracts, borrowed money, and sued in court to protect their business interests. For instance, in London during the 13th and 14th centuries, women were active in trades like brewing, baking, textile production, and retail. Guild records indicate female membership, sometimes even as heads of their own workshops. These women were not just assisting their husbands, they were recognized as skilled practitioners in their own right. A widow, in particular, often inherited her husband's business and continued to run it, demonstrating her competence and legal right to do so. In urban centers, women sometimes owned urban property which they could rent out or use for their own businesses. These properties were not just for living, they were assets that generated income and provided a basis for economic security. The idea that women were entirely devoid of property rights fails to account for the specific protections afforded to them in various legal codes and customary practices. Some regions, like those influenced by Germanic law, offered women even greater rights to inherit and manage property than areas under strict Roman law. A woman's dowry, which she brought into a marriage, often remained her own property, even if managed by her husband. Upon his death, it reverted to her, providing a financial safety net. This was not just a symbol, it was a tangible asset that gave her leverage and security. This historical research by scholars like Judith Bennett and Caroline Barron reveals countless examples of women acting as creditors, debtors, and plaintiffs in medieval courts, asserting their rights and protecting their assets. They were not merely passive recipients of male decisions, they actively engaged with the legal system to defend their interests. The perception of women as powerless property ignores the nuances of medieval legal systems, the variations across regions, and the very real ways women found and exerted power through economic means and legal frameworks. It overlooks the agency that women, especially widows and women in specific trades, exercised over their lives and their resources. Number 9. Medieval women never learned anything beyond needlepoint. The common image of medieval women often portrays them as uneducated, confined to domestic tasks, and utterly devoid of intellectual pursuits. This misconception suggests that knowledge and literacy were exclusive domains for men, especially for clergy and scholars, leaving women with no access to books or formal learning beyond basic household skills. While educational opportunities were certainly different from modern times and varied greatly by social class and location, the idea that medieval women were universally unlearned is a significant historical blunder. In reality, many women, particularly those from the upper classes and within monastic communities, achieved high levels of literacy and scholarship. Convents played a crucial role as centers of female education. For women who chose a religious life, or whose family sent them there, convents offered a structured environment for learning. Nuns were taught to read and write, primarily Latin, the language of scripture and scholarly texts. They copied manuscripts, illuminated books, and engaged in theological study. Some abbesses were powerful intellectual figures, managing vast libraries and overseeing schools within their convents that educated young girls. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, is a prime example. She was a prolific writer, composer, philosopher, mystic, and even a natural scientist whose works on theology, medicine, and botany gained wide recognition. Her correspondence with popes, emperors, and kings shows her intellectual standing and influence. She was not an isolated case. Other abbesses and nuns like Hildegard of Bingen, a 10th century German canoness, wrote plays, poems, and historical narratives demonstrating impressive classical learning. Noblewomen, even those not entering convents, often received an education that went beyond simple domestic arts. They learned to read and write in vernacular languages, sometimes Latin, to manage large households and estates, oversee servants, and understand accounts. Many noblewomen were responsible for supervising the education of their children and often possessed their own collections of books, including religious texts, romances, and chronicles. Christine de Pizan, a prominent female writer of the late 14th and early 15th centuries, supported herself and her family through her writing after her husband's death. Her works include historical accounts, moral treatises, and poetry, often defending women's capabilities and contributions. Her intellectual prowess and her career as a professional writer demonstrate that women could attain high levels of literacy and engage in sophisticated intellectual discourse. Literacy also extended to women in urban areas, particularly those involved in trade and commerce. Merchant women needed to read and write to keep accounts, manage inventories, correspond with suppliers, and handle legal documents. Guild records sometimes indicate that women were literate, a necessary skill for running a successful business. While formal schooling beyond the cloister was less common for women than for men, many learned to read and write at home from tutors or family members. Evidence from wills and inventories often shows that women owned books, indicating a desire and ability to read. Private literacy, though harder to quantify, was certainly present. The very existence of vernacular literature, like romances and devotional texts, suggests a broader audience, including women, who could read or have texts read to them. The idea that women were solely occupied with needlepoint misses the rich tapestry of their intellectual lives. From the learned abbesses who shaped theological thought to the urban women who managed complex businesses with written records, medieval women engaged with the written word and knowledge in various meaningful ways, defying the stereotype of universal ignorance. Their contributions to literature, scholarship, and household management required significant intellectual capabilities that were often cultivated through various forms of education. Number 8. Women were always stuck inside the castle walls. A persistent image of medieval women depicts them as perpetually confined within their homes, be it a humble cottage or a grand castle, with their lives revolving solely around domestic chores or aristocratic leisure. This widely held notion suggests that women had limited interaction with the outside world, rarely ventured beyond their immediate household, and certainly did not participate in public life or economic activities beyond the threshold of their dwelling. The idea that women were universally cloistered is a significant historical distortion. In reality, medieval women, regardless of their social standing, were frequently active participants in the public sphere, engaged in a wide array of activities that took them far beyond the perceived confines of their homes. Peasant women, who constituted the vast majority of the population, worked alongside men in the fields. They tilled the soil, harvested crops, tended livestock, and carried out numerous agricultural tasks essential for survival. This work often took them out of their cottages and into the communal fields, meadows, and forests. They walked to markets to sell surplus produce, eggs, or cheese, interacting with other villagers and merchants. Their lives were deeply intertwined with the rhythms of rural life, which necessitated movement and engagement with the broader community. Women in towns and cities were even more visibly active outside the home. They were integral to the urban economy. Women operated shops, managed market stalls, and sold goods like bread, ale, cloth, and produce. They were brewers, bakers, textile workers, innkeepers, and street vendors. Guild records and civic documents show women participating in trade, conducting business, and even managing workshops independently, especially as widows. These activities required constant movement within the town, negotiation with suppliers and customers, and participation in the bustling public life of the marketplace. For instance, in medieval Paris, women were prominent in various trades, including haberdashery, laundering, and silk weaving. They operated their businesses from shops that were often integrated into their homes, but still required them to interact with the public. Elite women, while perhaps not working in the fields or market stalls, were far from isolated. Noble women often managed large estates and castles in the absence of their husbands, which involved extensive travel to oversee properties, collect rents, and administer justice. They rode horses, traveled in carriages, and embarked on pilgrimages, sometimes over vast distances. The queens and powerful noblewomen frequently traveled with their courts, moving between residences, attending political gatherings, and even accompanying their husbands on campaigns or diplomatic missions. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example, traveled extensively, including participating in the Second Crusade to the Holy Land. Her journeys were not mere pleasure trips, but acts of political and social engagement. Even within the home, many medieval women were not confined to a single room. Castles and manor houses were often vibrant centers of activity, hosting numerous servants, visitors, and craftsmen. Women managed these complex households, which involved overseeing food production, textile manufacturing, and the well-being of many individuals. Their roles as managers often required them to move about the property, directing staff and overseeing various operations. The idea that women were stuck implies a passive existence, but medieval women were active agents in their daily lives, often necessitated by economic realities or social obligations. They were not just confined by walls, they were participants in the wider world, whether in the fields, the markets, or the courts of kings. The image of the cloistered woman fails to capture the dynamic and diverse ways women moved through and contributed to medieval society. Number 7. They never bathed and smelled awful all the time. A pervasive and rather unflattering misconception about medieval people, and medieval women in particular, is that they lived in a state of perpetual filth, never bathed, and therefore constantly smelled terrible. This idea often contributes to a broader mischaracterization of the Middle Ages as a dark and uncivilized period. It suggests a complete lack of personal hygiene practices and an indifference to cleanliness, which is a significant departure from historical reality. While medieval hygiene practices certainly differed from modern standards, the notion of universal dirtiness is a gross exaggeration. In fact, medieval people, including women, did practice various forms of bathing and personal care, and cleanliness was often valued for both health and religious reasons. Public bathhouses were common in many medieval towns and cities, particularly in the earlier and high medieval periods. These establishments offered facilities for communal bathing, and both men and women visited them, often on separate days or in separate areas. On records from cities like London, Paris, and Bologna mention numerous bathhouses where people could pay to wash themselves. For instance, in 13th century Paris, there were over 30 public bathhouses, indicating their widespread use. These were social spaces as much as hygienic ones, but their primary function was bathing. Wealthier individuals and those in castles or manor houses often had private bathing facilities. While not always elaborate, these could include wooden tubs where heated water was brought in. Archaeological finds and historical texts describe bathhouses or bathing rooms within castles. Noblewomen in particular would have had access to warm water and soaps, which were made from ashes and animal fats. Personal hygiene also involved more than just full-body bathing. Daily washing of hands and face was common. People used basins and pitchers for washing and laundered their clothes regularly. While clothing might not have been changed daily for everyone, outer garments were aired and cleaned, and undergarments were washed frequently. Many medieval texts, including medical treatises and etiquette guides, contain advice on personal cleanliness, emphasizing the importance of washing, brushing teeth, though often with herbal remedies or cloths, and keeping hair clean. Hair care was particularly important for women. They often used combs and various rinses to maintain their hair. Fragrant herbs, flower petals, and perfumes were also used to enhance personal freshness. Rosewater, lavender, and other floral essences were popular for washing and perfuming. For example, during the Black Death, while the understanding of disease transmission was limited, people often practiced increased hygiene, including burning aromatic herbs and washing to ward off illness. This shows a concern for cleanliness, even if based on incorrect medical theories. Monastic orders, for both men and women, often had strict rules regarding cleanliness and regular bathing, not just for spiritual purity, but for physical well-being. Monasteries often had sophisticated water systems for washing and sanitation. The persistent myth of unbathed medieval people likely stems from a comparison to modern standards of daily showering and plumbing, which were simply not available. However, considering the technology and resources of the time, medieval people, including women, made significant efforts to maintain personal hygiene. They were not indifferent to foul odors, or dirt, rather. They used the means available to them to stay as clean as possible, often more so than popular imagination suggests. Number 6. Having a baby was practically a guaranteed death sentence. The idea that childbirth in the Middle Ages was almost universally fatal for women is a deeply entrenched and alarming misconception. It paints a grim picture of women constantly living on the edge of death due to pregnancy, suggesting that the act of bringing new life into the world was an overwhelmingly perilous journey from which few women returned. While it is undeniable that childbirth carried significant risks and maternal mortality rates were considerably higher than today, the notion that it was a guaranteed death sentence is a dramatic overstatement that fails to acknowledge the realities of survival and the strategies employed to ensure safer deliveries. It also ignores the sheer number of women who gave birth multiple times and lived long lives. Whole maternal mortality rates in the medieval period are difficult to ascertain precisely due to limited and scattered records, but historians estimate them to be around 1 to 2% per birth, or perhaps higher, around 10 to 20% over a woman's reproductive lifetime. These figures, while high by modern standards, mean that the vast majority of births were successful and most women survived to have more children. If childbirth were a guaranteed death sentence, the population would have plummeted, not grown, as it did in many periods of the Middle Ages. Medieval society placed great importance on successful childbirth, and women often relied on female networks and skilled birth attendants to assist them. Midwives, who were typically older women with experience, played a crucial role. They were often highly respected figures in their communities, possessing practical knowledge passed down through generations. They understood basic anatomy, the stages of labor, and techniques for assisting difficult births. While their medical understanding lacked modern scientific knowledge, their practical skills were invaluable. They knew how to encourage labor, manage pain, and handle common complications. Women in labor were often surrounded by other women mothers, sisters, friends, and neighbors who provided emotional support, practical help, and shared their collective wisdom. This communal aspect of childbirth fostered an environment of care and shared experience. Religious practices also played a significant role, with prayers, relics, and invocations to saints believed to offer protection and assistance during labor. Though not medically effective in the modern sense, these practices provided psychological comfort and hope. Despite the risks, women endured multiple pregnancies and births. For example, Eleanor of Aquitaine had at least 10 children who survived into adulthood. Many other noble women and common women are recorded as having large families, indicating that they survived numerous deliveries. If each birth carried a near certain death sentence, such large families would have been impossible. The primary causes of maternal mortality were often complications like hemorrhage, infection, puerperal fever, and obstructed labor. Without antibiotics, blood transfusions, or surgical interventions like C-sections, these complications could quickly become fatal. However, not every woman experienced these severe issues. The common image also fails to account for the resilience of medieval women and the efforts made within their communities to support them through this critical life event. While the dangers were real and tragic when they occurred, childbirth was far from a guaranteed death sentence for every medieval woman, rather. It was a risky but generally survivable experience for the majority. Number 5, medieval marriages were only about force and arrangement. A common and somewhat romanticized view of medieval marriage suggests that it was solely a matter of arranged alliances, particularly among the nobility, driven purely by political, economic, or social advantage, with no regard for the feelings or desires of the individuals involved. This misconception implies that women, especially, had no agency in the marriage process, being entirely coerced into unions against their will, stripped of any choice or voice in such a pivotal life decision. While arranged marriages were indeed prevalent, especially in aristocratic circles, and practical considerations often outweighed romantic love, the idea that medieval marriages were only about force and arrangement, with no female input, is a significant oversimplification of a complex social institution. In reality, while direct choice in the modern sense was rare, women often had surprising avenues for agency, influence, and even resistance within the medieval marriage system. Among the nobility, marriages were indeed crucial for forging alliances, consolidating land, and securing power. However, even here, a woman's consent, or at least her ostensible consent, was legally significant. The canon law, which governed marriage across Western Europe, stipulated that marriage required the free consent of both parties. While this consent could be pressured, outright force was condemned. A marriage could be annulled if it was proven that one party was genuinely coerced. For example, a woman could protest a betrothal or a proposed marriage, sometimes with success, if she could demonstrate a pre-existing vow to another, a lack of parental authority, or genuine unwillingness. While not always successful, such protests show that women had a voice, however constrained. Dowry negotiations, though often led by men, often provided women with a form of indirect power. And the dowry was her contribution to the marriage, her portion, which often remained her property or reverted to her upon widowhood. A family might consider a daughter's preferences if it meant securing a more advantageous dowry or a smoother negotiation. A woman's beauty, intelligence, or reputation could also enhance her value as a prospective bride, giving her a certain leverage. For women of lower social standing, particularly in peasant communities or urban areas, the degree of arrangement could be less formal. While parents still played a role, young men and women often had more opportunities to meet and develop relationships, especially through communal work, festivals, and market interactions. Betrothals often occurred between individuals who knew each other. Consent for these unions was often more directly sought, and women might have greater scope to refuse an unwanted match or initiate a relationship. Customary law and social practice in many regions allowed for a surprising degree of informal courtship and partner selection. In some areas, couples could even declare themselves married through mutual consent and cohabitation without a formal church ceremony, though this was often frowned upon by authorities. The church itself, through canon law, provided a framework that, while patriarchal, upheld the principle of consent. It also recognized clandestine marriages, marriages without parental consent or public bans, as valid, though illicit. This sometimes gave individuals, including women, a loophole to marry against their parents' wishes, though with social consequences. While medieval marriages were certainly not love matches in the modern sense, the idea that they were only about force and arrangement, completely devoid of female input, is a generalization that overlooks the legal nuances, the varied social customs, and the ways women found to exert agency within the constraints of their time. Women were not entirely passive pawns in these arrangements. Number 4, the church completely crushed any power women had. A prevailing modern narrative suggests that the medieval church, as a patriarchal institution, was solely responsible for suppressing women, stripping them of all power, agency, and spiritual authority, reducing them to subordinate roles with no public voice. This view often points to theological interpretations that emphasized female inferiority and restrictions on women's roles in the clergy, leading to the conclusion that the church was an unyielding force of oppression for all women throughout the Middle Ages. This, however, is a significant oversimplification of a complex relationship between women and the church, which in reality offered both constraints and surprising avenues for influence, power, and spiritual expression for many medieval women. While the church certainly had patriarchal structures and teachings that limited women's public and clerical roles, it also provided unique opportunities for women to exercise significant authority and influence, particularly within monastic life. Convents and abbeys were not just places of seclusion, they were often powerful institutions in their own right, managing vast estates, overseeing numerous tenants, and wielding considerable economic and political influence. Abbesses, the heads of these convents, were often highly educated, literate women who held positions of immense authority. They governed communities of women, managed complex finances, engaged in legal disputes, and sometimes even held spiritual jurisdiction over male clergy. For instance, in some parts of medieval Germany, abbesses held princely status within the Holy Roman Empire, commanding feudal levies and sitting imperial diets. Figures, like Matilda of Quedlinburg, a 10th century abbess, exercised significant political power, acting as a regent for her nephew, the future Emperor Otto III. Beyond institutional power, the church offered women a legitimate path to intellectual and spiritual authority through mysticism, prophecy, and scholarship. Female mystics like Hildegard of Bingen, Bridget of Sweden, and Catherine of Siena gained widespread renown for their visions and writings. Their spiritual experiences were often seen as direct communication from God, granting them an authority that transcended traditional gender roles. They advised popes, kings, and other powerful figures, openly criticizing corruption and advocating for reforms. Their writings, which were widely circulated, provided spiritual guidance and intellectual inspiration for many. The cult of the Virgin Mary, which grew significantly throughout the Middle Ages, provided a powerful female figure at the heart of Christian devotion. Mary was venerated as the Queen of Heaven, a compassionate intercessor and a model of purity and strength. Her prominence offered a counterbalance to solely masculine imagery within the church and provided an avenue for female spiritual connection and empowerment. Furthermore, for many women, the church offered social services and community support. Hospitals, orphanages, and hospices were often run by religious orders, many of which included women. Women participated in charitable work, caring for the sick and the poor, and found a legitimate role in contributing to society outside of marriage and traditional family structures. While women were excluded from the priesthood and formal ecclesiastical hierarchy, their roles as anchoresses, hermits, and lay devout women provided individual spiritual paths and avenues for ascetic and devotional practices that were highly respected. The Church's teachings on marriage, while placing wives under their husbands, also condemned marital abuse, protected a woman's right to consent, and offered divorce or annulment in certain circumstances, which, in a limited way, offered some recourse for women in difficult marriages. The relationship between medieval women and the Church was thus far more nuanced than a simple narrative of total suppression. While hierarchical structures and societal norms certainly limited formal power, the Church also served as a critical arena where women could achieve education, wield institutional authority, express spiritual power, and find community and purpose. Number 3. All women lived lives of constant misery and oppression. The popular perception of medieval women often paints a universally bleak picture, a life of unremitting toil, suffering, and subjugation, with no room for joy, agency, or personal fulfillment. This narrative suggests that medieval society, with its patriarchal structures, high mortality rates, and limited freedoms, ensured that women lived in a constant state of misery and oppression, lacking any meaningful control over their own lives or destinies. While medieval life was undoubtedly challenging for most people, and women faced specific gendered constraints, the idea that all women lived in constant misery and oppression is a profound historical blunder that ignores the rich tapestry of human experience, resilience, and forms of agency present in the Middle Ages. It fails to account for the variety of women's lives across different social classes, regions, and time periods, and the ways they found satisfaction and influence within their own contexts. Women across social strata found fulfillment in their daily lives, often through their roles within families and communities. For peasant women, while labor was hard, there was a sense of purpose and contribution to the survival of their households and villages. The collective work, communal festivals, and social interactions provided moments of joy and solidarity. Women played crucial roles in nurturing families, preserving traditions, and contributing to the economic well-being of their communities. Their value was recognized in these vital contributions. For urban women, especially those in trades or commerce, there was often a sense of economic independence and professional pride. Managing a successful business, providing for one's family, and contributing to the bustling urban economy offered significant personal satisfaction. Records show women engaging in legal disputes, making contracts, and running workshops, indicating an active engagement with the world that transcended mere domesticity and offered opportunities for self-direction. Noble women, though constrained by dynastic expectations, often exercised considerable power and influence within their households and estates. They managed large retinues of servants, oversaw complex economic operations, and raised children who would inherit significant responsibility. Many found intellectual stimulation in reading and writing, patronizing arts, and engaging in courtly culture. The ability to manage a vast household or act as a regent for a husband or son provided a strong sense of purpose and achievement. For women who chose a religious life, convents offered a unique path to intellectual development, spiritual depth, and positions of authority. Abbesses governed large institutions, engaged in scholarly pursuits, and wielded significant spiritual and temporal power. For many, the contemplative life offered a profound sense of peace and purpose, far from any notion of misery. Women also found joy in their personal relationships, friendships, and community bonds. Letters, personal narratives, and legal documents reveal women supporting each other, forming strong networks, and finding companionship and love. While romantic love was not always the primary basis for marriage, affection and companionship often developed within marriages, and women found emotional connection with their spouses and children. The narrative of universal misery overlooks the evidence of resilience, adaptability, and the various ways women navigated their lives and found meaning. Medieval women were not passive victims, they were active agents who made choices, exerted influence, and experienced the full spectrum of human emotions, including happiness, love, and contentment, even within the confines of their era's societal norms and challenges. To impose a monolithic narrative of misery denies their lived experiences and the diverse forms of agency they possessed. Number 2. A woman's only worth was her looks and how many babies she could make. The prevalent misconception suggests that medieval society solely valued women for their physical attractiveness and, more importantly, for their fertility and ability to bear heirs. This perspective implies that a woman's entire identity, social standing, and purpose were intrinsically tied to her reproductive capacity and her adherence to conventional beauty standards, rendering other qualities like intelligence, skill, or character largely irrelevant. This view is a significant historical blunder because it greatly underestimates the diverse roles, skills, and attributes that medieval women were expected to possess and for which they were genuinely valued. While fertility was undeniably important, especially in a time of high mortality and the need for heirs, and physical appearance certainly played a role in social interactions, medieval society recognized and relied upon a much broader spectrum of a woman's contributions. For aristocratic women, beyond the expectation of bearing children, particularly male heirs, a woman's ability to manage a large household, administer estates, and represent her family's interests was highly prized. A noblewoman was expected to be a skilled chatelaine, capable of overseeing numerous servants, managing supplies, organizing feasts, and often running the estate in her husband's absence, sometimes for extended periods. This required significant organizational skills, literacy, numeracy, and a strong will. A woman like Eleanor of Aquitaine or Blanche of Castile, who ruled France as regent for her young son Louis IX, demonstrated immense political acumen, leadership, and administrative capabilities. Their worth was clearly tied to their strategic minds and effective governance, not just their looks or fertility. For women in the burgeoning urban centers, their skills and trades were highly valued. And women were often trained in various crafts and industries, including brewing, baking, textile production, merchandising, and keeping. A woman's ability to run a successful business, manage accounts, train apprentices, and contribute economically to her household was crucial. Many widows continued their husbands' businesses, demonstrating their competence and earning a living through their skills. These women were respected for their professional expertise and economic contributions, not just for their reproductive potential. In peasant communities, where the vast majority of people lived, women were indispensable to the agricultural economy. Their labor in the fields, their management of household resources, their skill in food preparation and preservation, and their ability to raise children who would become future laborers were all vital. A peasant woman's strength, resilience, practical knowledge, and hard work were celebrated and essential for family survival. Her worth was tied directly to her productive capacity and her ability to contribute to the family economy. Furthermore, women's intelligence, piety, and moral character were often highly esteemed. Learned women, especially those in convents or aristocratic households, were valued for their scholarship and spiritual insights. Mystics like Hildegard of Bingen and Catherine of Siena were revered for their wisdom and theological contributions. Their influence stemmed from their intellectual and spiritual authority, not primarily from their physical appearance or their capacity for childbirth. The role of women in religious life as abbesses, nuns, anchoresses, or pious laywomen provided avenues for status and respect that transcended physical attributes or reproductive functions. Their dedication to God, their charitable works, and their spiritual guidance were profoundly valued. While medieval society certainly placed importance on lineage and the continuation of the family line, reducing a woman's worth solely to her looks, and fertility ignores the vast range of practical skills, intellectual capabilities, administrative talents, and moral virtues that were actively sought, developed, and admired in women across all social strata. Medieval women were not one-dimensional figures, they were integral members of society whose multifaceted contributions were acknowledged and relied upon. Number 1. The entire medieval period was just a big backslide for women. A common and deeply ingrained misconception about the Middle Ages was that it represented a singular uniform dark age, where women's status universally declined, their rights diminished, and their lives became significantly worse compared to previous eras, such as Roman antiquity. This viewpoint often assumes a linear progression of women's rights and paints the entire 1,000-year span of the medieval period, roughly 500 CE to 1500 CE, as a monolithic era of regression for women. This is a profound historical blunder because it simplifies an incredibly diverse and dynamic period, ignoring regional variations, social complexities, and the ways in which women's experiences actually changed, sometimes for the better, across different centuries and geographies. The idea of a universal backslide over 1,000 years is simply not supported by the nuanced historical record. Firstly, the Dark Ages label itself is misleading. Historians now widely reject this term, recognizing the intellectual, cultural, and social dynamism of the period. For women, the situation was far from uniform or consistently declining. For instance, in the early medieval period, following the collapse of the Roman Empire, Germanic tribal laws often granted women more rights than later Roman law. These customary laws sometimes allowed women greater control over property, the right to represent themselves in legal matters, and sometimes even a degree of agency in marriage arrangements, not always present in late Roman civil law. For example, some Germanic codes allowed women to inherit land in the absence of male heirs, and their dowry was often seen as her personal property, providing a form of financial security. As feudalism developed, the role of noblewomen as managers of vast estates became critical. When their husbands were away at war or on pilgrimages, noblewomen frequently took on the responsibilities of running the entire estate, including managing finances, overseeing agricultural production, administering justice, and even defending castles. This role gave them significant practical power and authority within their local spheres. For example, during the Crusades, numerous women were left to govern extensive territories in Europe and even in the Crusader states, demonstrating their administrative capabilities and their recognized authority. The growth of urban centers and a merchant economy in the High Middle Ages, roughly 11th to 13th centuries, presented new opportunities for women, particularly those in the burgeoning middle classes. Third, women became active participants in trade, crafts, and commerce. Those guilds often had female members, and women ran their own businesses, sometimes independently, sometimes as widows inheriting their husbands' enterprises. This economic activity provided a degree of independence and agency that had not been universally present in earlier agrarian societies. In cities like Paris, London, and Florence, women were integral to the economic fabric, managing shops, lending money, and engaging in sophisticated commercial transactions. The Church, while patriarchal in its hierarchy, also offered distinct opportunities for women throughout the medieval period. Convents became centers of female education, intellectual life, and spiritual authority. Abbesses often wielded immense power, managing vast estates and influencing political affairs. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen not only ran powerful monasteries, but also advised emperors and popes, her authority stemming from her intellectual and spiritual prowess. The spiritual paths of anchoresses and mystics allowed women to gain immense respect and influence outside traditional social structures, often transcending gender expectations. While the late medieval period saw some tightening of restrictions, particularly in urban guilds and legal systems, it was by no means a consistent backslide across all aspects of women's lives or all regions. There were periods of greater opportunity and periods of greater constraint, varying by social class, geographic location, and specific legal traditions. To view the entire medieval period as a uniform regression for women is to overlook the incredible diversity of their experiences, their resilience, their active roles in economy and society, and the specific forms of power and agency they carved out for themselves across 1,000 years of history. It denies the complexity and dynamism of the medieval world and the diverse ways women lived within it.